And we're back with an educational and informative mini documentary from a series of videos I'd done back between 2018 and 2019. The world wasn't ready for these puzzle pieces yet, but with everything that's been revealed in the past few years, I'd say it's time to revisit this. Back then, the JFK files had not yet been released, which have confirmed some of the assertions I'd made regarding the potential of CIA involvement with his life coming to an end. Those files suspiciously have zero mention of Marilyn Monroe, who was rumored to have been having an affair with JFK, and being such a prolific figure of the time, and such a prominent aspect in that story, it seems strange for there to be no mention at all. But we do know a lot of the files are still being kept secret. Some documents that have surfaced, such as this Department of Defense ID, seems to confirm some of what I speculate in this video, that she had been brought on for some kind of covert military operation. Some sources have said that this ID was necessary due to her USO show performances, but with a quick search, it can be confirmed that no such ID is required to travel and perform at such shows. So keep all of that in mind while you learn more about this programming and control playbook, as well as the covert operations and experiments from which it was learned and originated. The first half is kind of like a history lesson, and it may even seem dull and somewhat boring. But in the second half, we talk more about what it all means and how it's impacted society and our everyday lives, and the lives of those who have sacrificed their privacy and freedom for the sake of our entertainment. As always, be sure to do your own research, use your discretion, and draw your own conclusions.
Mental patients felt they were used as the CIA's guinea pigs. They believe they are victims of covert CIA experiments.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
They kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks.
MKUltra was a program overseeing a series of CIA human experiments that began shortly after World War II, when the United States recruited Nazi scientists and doctors in exchange for their immunity. These individuals would have been held accountable for crimes against humanity with regards to human experimentation. Instead, the US government decided to hire them and take over those experiments. Governed by the US medical standard that requires informed consent of a patient before any human experimentation could take place. MK stands for the partial German equivalence, mind control, which perfectly describes more than 100 subprograms that explore different mind control tactics for the purpose of interrogation, brainwashing, blackmail, coercion, behavioral control, and so on. At the time, with various other military regimes researching and improving such methods, it seemed strategic from an intellectual level, and almost necessary to stay ahead of the game, so to speak. This is how they were able to garner the support and subordination of so many educated professionals to begin with. In addition, there was no external or internal transparency, and all of these clandestine subprograms were being carried out by different lab teams, professors, doctors, and other government agencies, the majority being unaware of each other. All of these experiments were intended to remain top secret. They were all secretly funded by the government and operating under the guise of scientific advancement. The CIA was mainly interested in interrogation techniques to be used on prisoners of war and other diplomatic strategists, due to a suspected double agent serving in Japan. Thus, their search for a supposed truth serum began. These experiments began in the late 40s, early 50s, with the initial programs being referred to as Project Bluebird and Project Chatter, and they included the use of various chemicals, pharmaceuticals, narcotics, and even electroshock therapy. Project Bluebird was later renamed Project Artichoke when it became a joint venture between the CIA, FBI, and US military forces, including the Navy and Air Force. Early on, Sidney Gottlieb, a poisons expert, was made director of the CIA Technical Services staff in the Chemical Division. He would lead and supervise preparation and experimentation of lethal poisons and narcotics with regards to mind control. Soon after the discovery and synthesis of LSD by a Swiss scientist, Albert Hofmann, an article appeared in the American Psychiatric Journal. Former member of the OSS, Alfred Hubbard joined ranks with Dr. Humphrey Osmond to further research and experiment with the substance. The CIA took great interest in these early studies that were performed mainly on rats, before Hoffman accidentally performed a self-experiment and described his experience as affected by a remarkable restlessness, combined with a slight dizziness. At home I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I found the daylight to be unpleasantly glaring. I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense, kaleidoscopic play of colors. After about 2 hours, this condition faded away. Hoffman conducted a secondary self-experiment, which he later referred to as Bicycle Day. Little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in a constant flux. The first documentation of the use of LSD in CIA experiments was recorded late 1951. This eventually opened up an entirely new avenue of research and experimentation. This is also when they began to push the limits as to what could be considered consent with regards to human experimentation. By 1952, Project Artichoke had begun exploring the use of neurosurgery as a tool for behavior modification. The scope of the project was outlined in a memo dated January 1952 that stated, "Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even go against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation?" Later that year, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, alongside his colleague Abram Hoffer, discovered the similarities between mescaline and the adrenaline molecule and began experimentation at a hospital in Saskatchewan, Canada. Soon after they isolated the chemical compound, which they later named adrenochrome, they began conducting several small-scale studies involving 15 or fewer human subjects. They found that adrenochrome triggered psychotic reactions such as thought disorder, derealization, and euphoria, similar to the symptoms of schizophrenia. This led them to believe that illnesses like paranoid schizophrenia might be a form of self-intoxication caused by one's own body, and induced by an overabundance of adrenaline in one's system. Between 1953 and 1954, the CIA had shifted their directive and acquired safe houses in New York in order to begin their next project, which would be referred to as Operation Midnight Climax. They then employed a variety of women of the night who were meant to lure clients back to these safe houses, where they were to give them various substances without their knowledge, focusing mainly on LSD, all while being monitored behind two-way glass. Gottlieb wanted to investigate whether and how it was possible to modify an individual's behavior by covert means. Former Narcotics Bureau officer George Hunter White led the first of these experiments, originating in New York City's Greenwich Village, with no regard of the legal implications and human rights violations. These experiments soon expanded to the general public, when CIA operatives began dosing people in restaurants, bars, and beaches, blatantly abusing the medical standards regarding consent. During this time, various literary figures, psychologists, and philosophers had also become aware of this mood-altering, mind-expanding substance. Writer Aldous Huxley was the first to publish his experience with LSD, which he volunteered for under the supervision of Dr. Humphrey Osmond in his novel Doors of Perception. Alfred Hubbard, with help from Osmond, was able to dispense LSD to ready and willing participants, and had introduced more than 6,000 people, including scientists, politicians, intelligence officials, diplomats, and religious figures. Hubbard became known as Captain Trips, traveling around with his leather case containing a variety of psychedelics, including pure LSD and psilocybin mushrooms. Meanwhile, the CIA had taken to dosing officials within their own ranks, without their knowledge or consent, as an ongoing operational experiment. This brought about the suspicious death of Army biochemist Frank Olson, who had allegedly fallen out of his hotel window several days after he'd been dosed by Sidney Gottlieb himself, along with a handful of other U.S. Army Special Ops officers at a joint CIA military retreat. Afterwards, Frank had fallen into a deep depression and developed severe paranoia, which led to a complete nervous breakdown. He was sent to see a physician in New York, employed by the CIA, but on his last night in Manhattan, he had allegedly thrown himself out of the window of his 10th floor hotel room. The exact circumstances and events leading up to Frank's passing are still being called into question to this day. In 2017, Netflix released a miniseries called Wormwood, dissecting this event. Likely due to this incident, at least in part, the CIA was forced to scale their experiments involving LSD way back and find more legal means of testing on humans. The CIA had Dr. Harris Isbell, the director of research for the NIM Addiction Research Center, start conducting LSD tests on inmates at the Lexington Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, where they were being treated for addiction. These experiments were most likely operating under Project MK Delta, which focused on testing chemicals and narcotics with regards to mind and behavioral control. The subjects in Isbell's experiments are described as volunteers, as they had all signed consent forms, but none were specifically aware of how they were going to be experimented on. This shows a clear and obvious disconnect between the CIA's approach versus searching out the plethora of willing and eager guinea pigs, which Huckley referred to himself as when agreeing to being dosed. Mid-1954, Sandoz Laboratories' patent for producing LSD had expired, and US-based pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly begins developing an entirely synthetic fabrication process for LSD, no longer constrained by limited ergot supplies. Eli Lilly then begins producing the substance in quantity, specifically for use by the CIA. The birth of the hippie revolution can partially be attributed to the US government's introduction of LSD to the population. With so many different secret and illegal means of experimentation and corruption going on behind the scenes, it became very easy for the general public to get their hands on what came to be known as acid. In 1955, Huxley, along with many others, voluntarily experimented once again with this newly synthesized substance, LSD-25, which inspired his book, Heaven and Hell. Instead of acknowledging the many willing individuals looking to further experiment with psychedelics, the CIA expanded their covert operations. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps began conducting what they referred to as classified human subject research at the Edgewood Arsenal facility in Maryland. They evaluated the impact of low-dose chemical warfare agents on military personnel and tested protective clothing, pharmaceuticals, and vaccines. These experiments were documented under Project MK Naomi, which focused on the potential use of chemicals, narcotics, and other toxins for biological warfare. The CIA also employed Dr. Carl Pfeiffer in 1955, a physician and biochemist researching schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. He also served as a chair of the pharmacology department at Emory University. He began collaborating with Abram Hoffer, who had performed earlier studies regarding schizophrenia, and expanded his own research based on Abram's findings with the application of LSD-25. The interesting thing is it seemed they were more focused on creating schizophrenia-like symptoms rather than finding patients with schizophrenia to test cures on. Dr. Pfeiffer conducted a majority of his experiments at the Atlanta Penitentiary and the New Jersey Border Town Reformatory. He also had informed consent to conduct these tests on subjects, but again, none of the volunteers knew exactly what to expect. One subject tested on by Dr. Pfeiffer was notorious crime boss Whitey Bulger, while he was serving time in Atlanta. He later went on to describe the experiments and how they affected him and the other inmates negatively due to the extreme doses and circumstances in which they were tested under. Mid-1955, the CIA was able to have Agent James Moore infiltrate the public psychedelic community by posing as a professor and convincing two naive men to lead him on a trip to Mexico in search of magic mushrooms. Although he was able to retrieve samples, CIA labs were unable to isolate the most active components. The following year, Dr. Humphrey Osmond officially proposed the term psychedelic at a meeting at the New York Academy of Sciences. He said the word meant mind manifesting, from the Latin psyche and delos, and he called it clear, euphonious, and uncontaminated by other associations. Aldous Huxley had sent Osmond a rhyme suggesting his own new word. To make this trivial world sublime, take half a gram of phanerothyme. Osmond countered with, to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. By 1957, the CIA reports that 6 psychoactive drugs have moved out of the experimental stage and into operational use. In the meantime, Dr. Ewan Cameron had begun tests using LSD as a de-patterning tool, with intent to reprogram personalities. His research quickly gains the attention of the CIA, and Cameron became involved in many experiments under MKUltra, some of which were later published in the Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual in July 1963. But we'll explore this manual later. The CIA issued sizable grants to Dr. Cameron in support of his de-patterning research, as well as approved his studies regarding sensory deprivation in pursuant of the initial goal. He commuted from Albany, New York to Montreal, Canada once a week to conduct his research at McGill's Allen Memorial Institute between 1957 and 1964. These experiments were conducted on patients that had entered a mental facility for minor disorders such as anxiety and postnatal depression. Many suffered permanent debilitation after these treatments. The treatment involved putting patients into a prolonged period of sleep for several days through the administration of barbiturates, drugs that depress the central nervous system, and hallucinogens such as LSD. This was followed up with electroshock therapy sessions spread over the course of several weeks, ultimately reducing patients to a childlike state. Cameron believed that once reduced to such a state, they could be reprogrammed with new thoughts and ideas through what he referred to as psychic driving. Patients were exposed to hundreds of thousands of repetitions of a single statement. They were also administered muscular paralytic drugs such as Coercion, a poison to subdue them for the purposes of exposure to the looped messages. The majority of outcomes included incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to speak, and thinking their interrogators were their parents. The CIA extended the specifications of these studies to psychiatrist William Sargent, who began experimenting on his own patients without their knowledge or consent, causing similar long-term damage. It was later determined that Cameron had conducted a series of side experiments involving children, all of which had been sexually abused. One of those children was filmed numerous times performing sex acts with high-ranking government officials as a blackmailing method to ensure further funding for his experiments. To this day, the CIA has kept most of the details of these specific de-patterning experiments in the dark, through destruction of files and/or the signing of non-disclosure agreements. These are suspected to be part of the collective and ultra-classified experiments that fall under Project Monarch, in which its existence is still widely denied by the CIA. Project Monarch represented the pinnacle goal of mind/behavioral control research. Reprogramming an individual would give you absolute control of another human being and would help fill out the CIA's repertoire of human control techniques. To reprogram an enemy official and send him back to do your bidding? And imagine its other uses. It's totally right up their alley. In 1958, the US military introduced LSD to their experimentation at the Edgewood Arsenal facility. Dr. Gerald Klee and Dr. Van Sim began covertly dosing volunteers in extremely large amounts. The following year, Albert Hoffman publishes the synthesis of psilocybin, which the CIA had previously been unable to identify. Dr. Harry Isbell placed an order, where he then injected it into 9 inmates at the Lexington Public Health Service Hospital, where he had already been conducting similar experiments with a variety of other substances. The results were not much different than his testing with LSD. American poet, philosopher, and writer Allen Ginsberg tries LSD for the first time. He later took an active role in normalizing LSD. Along with Timothy Leary, an American psychologist and writer, they worked together to promote its common use and benefits. April 15, 1961, the Bay of Pigs ended in disaster, which was the CIA's plan to overthrow the Cuban dictatorship and assassinate Fidel Castro, due to tensions between the US and Cuban government regarding oil refinement and trade. CIA Director Dulles and Deputy CIA Director Charles Cabell are forced to resign. John McCrone is assigned as new director and is instructed to clean house. President Kennedy vows to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. At the end of April 1961, the U.S. Army initiates LSD interrogation experiments in Western Europe on a 90-day mission called Operation Third Chance, where they dosed random citizens with LSD and documented the results. They operated quite similarly to Operation Midnight Climax, but with alternative ways of luring unsuspecting citizens back to the safe houses. And being in a foreign country, they were under less pressure of requiring informed consent. Major Ernest Clovis, leading the mission, had reservations regarding these experiments, as it was difficult to isolate the effect of the drug amid the chaos that the team manufactured. By 1962, the concoctions resulting from the Edgewood Arsenal experiments became part of the U.S. Army's standardized chemical warfare practice, even though it had failed them during the invasion of Cuba. Around this time, Congress passes new drug safety regulations, and the FDA designates LSD as an experimental drug and restricts further research. This caused the CIA to withdraw all above-ground studies. April 10, 1963, the U.S. Army launches Operation Derby Hat in Asia, an LSD field test by the U.S. Army's Pacific Wing in Hawaii, using 7 foreign nationals from friendly countries as guinea pigs. Shortly before it began, the exercise was aborted because of political problems. The use of LSD was becoming an increasingly controversial issue. There was growing publicity surrounding Timothy Leary's personal interest project at Harvard, and behind the scenes, the Kennedy administration was concerned about the newly discovered attempts by senior CIA officers to hide the existence of MKUltra. William S. Burroughs joined the positive psychedelic movement alongside Allen Ginsberg when they published the Yage Letters, which chronicled their visits to the Amazon rainforest, dating back as early as 1953, where they experimented with Yage, also known as ayahuasca, a naturally occurring hallucinogen that is now used therapeutically in today's society. In the summer of 1963, Timothy Leary and his colleague Richard Alpert were fired from Harvard. According to Harvard President Nathan M. Pusey, Leary was dismissed for leaving classes without permission or notice, and Alpert for allegedly giving psilocybin to an undergraduate. Alpert had devoted himself to joining Leary in experimentation and intensive research regarding the potential healing effects of hallucinogenic drugs such as psilocybin, LSD-25, and other chemicals through their Harvard Psilocybin Project. Apparently, if you're not following the CIA's darker narrative regarding psychoactives, your research and experiments were not welcome. November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, while riding in a presidential motorcade through Dealey Plaza. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and accused of firing the shots from the Texas School Book Depository. He was charged with the murder of a police officer and the assassination of JFK. He denied shooting anyone, claiming that he was a patsy, and he too was assassinated by Jack Ruby on November 24th, 1963, before he could be defended or prosecuted. Ruby was arrested and convicted for the murder of Oswald, but was able to successfully appeal his conviction and death sentence. The psychiatrist who performed Ruby's court-appointed psych evaluation was Louis Jolly West, who was best known for being the head of UCLA's Department of Psychiatry. It was later determined that he too had performed isolated MK studies, subcontracted and funded by the CIA while working at the University of Oklahoma in 1956. He primarily studied hypnosis, suggestibility, and dissociative states. There are many theories regarding what actually occurred that day. There's the security guard as the second gunman, the Manchurian candidate, the polka dot dress woman, along with other speculations of CIA involvement. Now let's rewind a moment. The CIA was at the threat of being dissolved by JFK, and after their absolute embarrassment by their failure in Cuba. How could they have best used their learned techniques and tactics to silence the presidential opposition, regain control of their ultra-secretive outfit, and save face? Cue Marilyn Monroe. Let's pretend for a moment that Project Monarch was very real, specializing in trauma-based mind control and what its potential for human application would be. Allegedly, there are 4 different levels of Monarch programming. The first is Alpha, which is essentially a base personality, a deprogrammed individual that could be trained and prompted to perform difficult tasks with no attachment and while disregarding self-preservation. It's also theorized that this programming unlocks both sides of the brain and can improve both physical and mental strength. The second is Beta, which first requires alpha deprogramming and to then instigate primordial sex programming. This program eliminates moral convictions and stimulates more primitive sexual instincts devoid of inhibition. The psychic driving of these individuals is amplified by various sexually charged forms of torture and abuse to further push the victim into their primal core, which later resurfaces as an insatiable sexual appetite while being under the complete control of their owner. The third, Delta, again first requiring alpha deprogramming, creates a specially trained agent intended for acts of terrorism or assassination devoid of fear and basic self-preservation instincts. Their psychic driving involves torture and/or being forced to torture or even kill someone that they may or may not be bonded to, which eventually programs them to kill, and if caught, to self-destruct, in order to protect the identity of their owners if caught, rendering them useless to any interrogation techniques. The fourth is Theta, the least likely to have ever come to fruition, which included pushing the envelope for human psychic abilities. The research in these projects was mostly abandoned after devoting many years with little to no results. The intent of this programming was to be able to give and receive mental transmissions of messages, as well as to mentally move objects or cause harm. This can be compared to old movies like Firestarter, and more recently, the Netflix series Stranger Things, which are both loosely based on Project Montauk, another sub-project of MKUltra that took place at the Montauk Air Force Station in Montauk, New York. Now, considering the possibility that this too exists, considering pretty much everything else people suspected the CIA to be doing between the 40s and 70s turning out to be very real, let's look at the timing of when Marilyn Monroe came into contact with JFK. The exact date is unclear, but we can confirm it was in the second half of 1961, just after the Bay of Pigs. There are a number of instances they could have met and began contacting each other privately. The only public admission of the two having an affair was after the two attended a party together in Palm Springs, March 24, 1962, and claiming to have first officially met February 1962 at a dinner in New York, in spite of having come into contact with each other a handful of times prior, independent of each other's spouses. Her famous "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" was performed on May 13, 1962 at a celebration for his 45th birthday. First Lady Jackie Kennedy was not in attendance. What a convenient potential distraction from political affairs needing his full and undivided attention. This, however, did not distract John Kennedy from wanting to get to the bottom of what was happening within his administration, including CIA operations. In the summer of 1962, he reportedly had a secret taping system installed in the White House, which recorded conversations Kennedy had with his own cabinet members, as well as them amongst themselves. Was this all by chance? Or do you think it's possible that Marilyn Monroe was a beta-controlled operative, planted to distract JFK, or possibly to create enough scandal and media fodder to keep people distracted from the Cuban Missile Crisis? Or something else? What are the odds that Marilyn Monroe was even a suitable candidate for reprogramming? Well, let's have a brief look over her history, and compare it to what we already know. Marilyn's mother Gladys Pearl Baker married John Newton Baker at the age of 15. John was an extremely abusive man, 9 years her senior. Gladys had 2 children by Baker, Robert, born in 1917, and Bernice, born 1919. She had successfully filed for divorce in 1923 and was to maintain sole custody of her 2 children, but Baker kidnapped them and moved them to Kentucky. In 1924, Gladys married Martin Edward Mortensen, but they separated only a few months later, finalizing their divorce in 1928. Marilyn Monroe was born Norma Jean Mortensen in the LA County Hospital on June 1, 1926. She was unaware that she had any siblings until she was 12, and met them for the first time as an adult. Gladys was not prepared for a child whatsoever, financially or mentally, and she moved her and her newborn into an evangelical Christian foster home, ran by Albert and Ida Bolander, a very devout couple who believed that drinking, smoking, dancing, and playing cards were invented by the devil, and that order, cleanliness, and discipline were absolute evidence of virtue. After 6 months, Gladys left Marilyn to work in the city, and would visit her on weekends, where she was quite cold and unattached. She never kissed, hugged, or held her small daughter, and when Marilyn would stay with her mother to visit, she recalls being very frightened, and that she would spend a lot of time hiding in the closet among the clothes. At some point during this time, Albert gifted a small dog to Marilyn, which she named Tippy. When she began school, he would follow her every day and wait to play with her at recess. Marilyn was very attached to Tippy, which likely helped her cope with her detachment from her mother and her strict religious family. When Marilyn was 6, she had to have her tonsils removed, where after surgery she had complications and needed to remain in the hospital for an extended period of time. Although the story was told differently, Marilyn recalls in her autobiography that when she returned from the hospital, Tippy was so delighted to see her again that he began barking and running towards her. The neighbor was yelling at Tippy to shut up and chased after him with a garden hoe. He swung the hoe and cut Tippy in half, right before her eyes. After that incident, Marilyn's mother temporarily moved her to a new family, a young English couple named George and Maud Atkinson. Then in the summer of 1933, her mother was able to secure a loan and purchase a small home in Hollywood, California, where she took her 7-year-old Marilyn as well as the English couple along with her. This living arrangement was intended to help single mother Gladys, as she was working double shifts at a studio. By January 1934, Gladys had a mental breakdown and was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. After spending several months in a rest home, she was committed to the Metropolitan State Hospital in Norwalk, California. Marilyn became a ward of the state and stayed in an orphanage until her mother's friends Grace and Doc Goddard took responsibility over her and her mother's affairs. By the age of 9, Marilyn had briefly stayed with Grace and her husband, as well as several other families. And in September of 1935, Grace left Marilyn at an orphanage once again, after she was sexually abused by a boarder of one of the families she stayed with. The orphanage staff felt she would be much happier living with a familiar family and urged the couple to take custody of her. Grace eventually became her legal guardian in 1936. However, she could not afford to collect Marilyn from the orphanage until the summer of 1937. This was meant to be a long-term solution, but her stay with the Goddards was cut short because Doc had also begun making passes at poor young Marilyn. She was then placed with Grace's aunt, Anna Lauer, September of 1938, where she began attending Emerson Junior High and accompanied Anna to weekly church services. Marilyn excelled at school, in spite of the 2.5-mile walk, especially in writing, and she even contributed to the school paper. That is until Lauer fell ill, and Marilyn was forced to return to live with the Goddards in Van Nuys in 1941, at the age of 15. Soon after her return, the Goddards were going to be relocated to West Virginia for Doc's job. California law would not allow the couple to take Marilyn out of state, so she was due to return to the orphanage. Instead, she quickly became involved with a neighbor's son, 21-year-old James Doherty, and the two became wed just after her 16th birthday. This was later revealed to be more of an arranged marriage than a decision that Marilyn had made herself. Doherty worked at a local factory, and Marilyn stopped attending classes, as her duties of being a housewife took priority. Jim enlisted in the Merchant Marine crew and was stationed on Santa Catalina Island. While living there together, Marilyn soon realized how incompatible the two were, and later stated she had begun dying of boredom. Fortunately, Doherty was shipped out to the Pacific in April of 1944, where he would remain for 2 years. During that time, Marilyn went to live with Jim's parents, and began working at the Radioplane Munitions Factory. She enjoyed her newfound freedom and the ability to operate independently. Late 1944, she met the photog David Conover, who was sent by the U.S. Army to take morale-boosting photos of the female workers. Although none of her pictures were used in this instance, Conover was a catalyst in Marilyn becoming signed with Blue Book Modeling Agency in August of 1945. After reconfiguring her look and style, she was able to begin securing dozens of paid photo shoots. She was extremely ambitious and hardworking, as noted by the agency's owner, Emmeline Sneevely. Near the end of 1945, Marilyn's mother Gladys was released to a care home where she would do light house duties, and Grace arranged for Marilyn to go visit her. Her mother was an empty shell of her former self, and after mostly silence and sadness, Marilyn left Gladys her contact information and left. By Christmas time, Marilyn made the separation from Jim official and moved back to Anna Lauer's apartment. She began receiving numerous letters from her mother, asking her to take her in, promising that she would find a job. With some reluctance, she sent Gladys some money to bring her out to Los Angeles from Portland, Oregon. The two acquired the apartment above Anna's, who helped Gladys get a job in a department store. All the while, she continued working with Blue Book. Marilyn appeared on 33 magazine covers, as well as various advertisements and other publications. In July of 1946, she signed with an acting agent named Ben Lyon, and 20th Century Fox had her sign a standard 6-month contract to prevent another studio from signing her while she improved her acting skills. Her contract officially began in August of 1946, which is also when she decided on the stage name Marilyn Monroe. Although she received no acting jobs during that 6 months, she dedicated her time to acting, singing, and dance classes. She also spent a lot of time at the studio observing others and trying to promote herself, making efforts to impress crew members and executives. Her divorce from Jim was finalized in September of 1946, and shortly after, her mother Gladys moved back to Oregon, where Marilyn sent her money to help her support herself, in spite of having very little to no part in Marilyn's upbringing. After her contract was renewed in February of 1947, Marilyn was given her first 2 film roles as a small bit actor. The studio had also decided to enroll her in the Actors Laboratory Theater. Although ambitious and enthusiastic, her teachers felt she was too insecure to have any real future in acting, so Fox chose not to renew her contract in August of 1947. She then returned to modeling and also worked as a dancer in background scenes. With absolute determination, she continued her studies at the Actors Lab, while dabbling in sexual relationships with studio executives and collecting a handful of small acting parts. She soon became romantically involved with Johnny Hyde, the vice president of the William Morris Agency. Hyde paid for Monroe to have plastic surgery, and in 1949 she posed nude for photographer Tom Kelly. Late 1950, after having a few more bit parts under her belt, Hyde was able to negotiate a 7-year contract for Monroe with Fox. Unfortunately, Hyde succumbed to a heart attack only a few days later, which devastated her. Before she increased in popularity, and after learning her nudes were to be leaked, she chose to admit to having them taken. And although this was only meant to be damage control, it catapulted her from her then little-known status to blonde bombshell. She was then able to secure more high-profile acting roles, and after a series of affairs, failed marriages, miscarriages, mental and physical health problems, and many disputes with Fox executives, well, the rest is history, perhaps to be explored in another video. So, she was never able to attach to any particular parental figure, there was sexual abuse by adults meant to protect her, she was passed around and shared among strangers in whichever way suited them, trauma through constant abandonment, followed up by the death of a closely bonded father figure of her own choosing, that she had willfully become romantically involved with. Based on the parameters discussed previously with regards to the Monarch program, do you think it's fair to say that Marilyn had already suffered the systematic conditioning required to enter a subject into beta programming? Is it possible she is the original prototype for the use of reprogramming an individual for financial gain in Hollywood as a sex symbol, while doubling as a CIA operative who can use such powers for espionage or sexual blackmail to further the agenda of the agency? Perhaps the first and last time the CIA had created a dual operative, but is it possible that Hollywood continued to pursue and refine such practices for their own gain? Regardless of the intentions or hidden agendas that may or may not have been manipulated and orchestrated by the CIA, Marilyn Monroe died August 4th, 1962, under very suspicious circumstances. It's very publicly known that for many years Monroe had been dependent on amphetamines, barbiturates, and alcohol, either by her own choice or pressed upon her by her managers. She suffered from depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and chronic insomnia. She had spent the majority of 1961 in and out of hospitals for a wide variety of health issues, and spent a great deal of time closed off from the outside world, deprived of any sensory objects like television or radio. Is it possible she was being reprogrammed during the year or so before she was to meet JFK? Was her decreasing mental stability a result of some kind of breakdown in programming, or the cocktail of intoxicants? Or perhaps she was no longer needed, and more of a detriment to the operation than an aid, and needed to be disposed of. Many theories have been discussed since, some involving both John and Bobby Kennedy, others speculating the involvement of mobsters like Jimmy Hoffa. Regardless, both Marilyn Monroe and John Kennedy died under extraordinarily suspicious circumstances, while allegedly having an affair, and during a time that the CIA was under threat of being dissolved, or at the very least exposed for all the human rights violations they had committed and had continued to commit at that point. JFK's brother, Bobby Kennedy, was assassinated only a few years later, and is also shrouded by skepticism and different theories that contradict the official narrative. Is that entire scenario not a perfect example of how all those levels of reprogramming and various other mind control techniques they had been testing and innovating up until this point could be applied publicly and tested simultaneously? Well, let's have a look at that newly published Kubark interrogation manual published July 1963, right after Marilyn's and right before JFK's death, shall we? In the years to follow, the government attempted to suppress the flood of LSD into the hands of the public, with the hippie revolution in full swing. People began drawing inspiration and fuel from the merry pranksters responsible for the liquid Kool-Aid acid test, not to mention the Grateful Dead and the efforts of Leary and the like. Many festivals and activism campaigns were staged in support of the recreational use of psychedelic and other natural substances, as well as peace, anti-war, and countless other human rights movements. Meanwhile, the CIA was soon to be called under scrutiny by the Senate. By 1966, the CIA was forced to halt the remainder of their operations in the U.S., and after years of the government clashing with the general population with regards to war, with a strong belief that the foreign invasion was based on corporate interest, a public uprising had erupted. The peaceful protests, marches, sit-ins, mass gatherings for festivals of peace highlighted the entire era. This era encapsulates some of the most iconic moments of all time, when it comes to interconnectedness, oneness, love for nature, and all of humanity. Once upon a time, the spoken word, the real human connection, the passion could spread like a wildfire and create something bigger than us. We are now so connected digitally, but so disconnected in real life. In 1972, newly appointed President Richard Nixon fired CIA Director Helms, but coincidentally, just before being terminated, Sidney Gottlieb and Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all CIA documents and records. As a result of a clerical error, 7 boxes were spared, which have slowly become declassified and released to the public more recently. In the aftermath of Watergate, new CIA Director James Schlesinger orders all CIA employees to inform him of illegal actions they witnessed or have conducted within their operations. He soon learned of Army biochemist Frank Olson's death, and part of that resulting report was leaked to investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. In May of 1974, Hersh wrote an article for the New York Times detailing criminal CIA domestic operations, which created an uproar. President Ford appointed a committee chaired by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller to investigate intelligence improprieties. In June of 1974, President Ford's Chief of Staff Donald Rumsfeld and his deputy Dick Cheney advocated for persecuting Hirsch for revealing classified information. The matter is later referred to the Justice Department. Despite their prudent efforts to cover up the corruption, the details of MKUltra were unpacked and assessed at private Senate hearings. Sidney Gottlieb was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. In 1975, the public Senate hearings began, but the subcommittee pursued very few cases, and even fewer families received any financial compensation. Those who were compensated included Frank Olson's family and the family of tennis player Harold Blauer, who had entered a facility for depression after a divorce and whose cause of death was also covered up. Since then, dozens, if not hundreds, have stepped forward, claiming to be witnesses and or victims of MKUltra, or victims of the techniques formulated during MKUltra. Others claim to be witnesses to some other branch of mind control and or human exploitation with close ties to the government. But oftentimes these people are discredited and deemed mentally unwell, as many of them suffer from mental disorders as a symptom of the trauma they've experienced and or witnessed. Their memories are scattered and sometimes they have trouble following one train of thought, leading them to appear even more crazy. Fragmentation of memory is a type of memory disruption pertaining to the flaws or irregularities in sequences of memories and coherence in content in the narrative or story of the event. During a traumatic experience, memories can be encoded irregularly, which creates imperfections in the memory. These individuals are also likely to have other issues, including dissociation and PTSD, which makes it that much easier to discredit and or dispose of them.
Thanks for watching. I'm sure this has given you a lot to consider regarding this ultra-secretive program that's experimentation had ended in the late 70s, but how all of the techniques and tactics learned could be in applicable use to this day, in various industries, as well as for military purposes. I think it's safe to say that in the very least, that the interrogation tactics that were published could also double as tools for coercion and control, since this was the ultimate goal, to not only extract information, but maintain control over certain members of the populace. We will be exploring more about how these techniques appear to be used in the entertainment industry, and how the outcome of severe and or complex trauma can be manipulated and leveraged for nefarious purposes, since victims of complex trauma are prime candidates for reprogramming, and what that implies when we consider the backgrounds of some A-listers, especially now that more has been revealed about the dark side of Hollywood. So make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the flip side.